למנסח על מחלת, משכיל לדawith. The fool said in his heart, "There is no God." They corrupted themselves. They performed an abominable evil. There was no one who did good. God looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any who acted wisely, seeking after God. They have all been faithless. They have become corrupt together. No one does good, not even one. Shall not all who do evil be made to know it? They consume my people as they consume bread. They do not call upon God. There they feared a fear where there was no cause for fear, for God had scattered the bones of those that besieged you. You have shamed them because God despised them. Who will bring Israel salvation from Zion? When God brings his people home, let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad.
Guite incipiens, a response to Psalm 14. When heaven's hidden gates are drawn apart and our captivity is ended, we'll rejoice. But now the fool's in charge, and in his heart he only echoes his own emptiness. No God, no vestiges of reverence disturb his vanity. Just weariness and mockery, just cruel insolence and greed that still consumes the poor like bread. These only seem to move him. Violence is like a drug to him. He cocks his head and speaks his poison words with hissing tongue, and yet we still believe him. Let him dread the day that's coming. It will not be long. The poor have cried, and now they have been heard. The fool will fall before their joyful song.
Thank you, Malcolm. Sue, I asked Malcolm to read Psalm 14 before we start on Psalm 53, which we're going to be talking about today, because obviously these are almost the same psalm. I mean, I think you say somewhere that one Jewish commentator says the reason that there were two versions of it, one was written by David prophesying the fall of the first temple and the other the fall of the second temple. But the difference between them are quite subtle, really, aren't they?
Yes. I think it's interesting that each of them starts with the fool and each of them ends with the idea of God's presence in Zion. That's what makes them sort of very clearly similar. But they are different. They use different names for God, not entirely, but the beginning and end. At the beginning of Psalm 15 and 14 and 53, we have God called Elohim, but then in 14, the word Yahweh, Adonai, the Jewish name for God, is preferred, and it's Elohim in the other one. So different names. And I think one of the key things, they've got extended title in 53 as well, but the key thing, and it's one thing interesting that I think Malcolm brought out in that poem, on his poem on 14, is that Psalm 14 is much more concerned, if you look at it as a whole, with the poor, God's compassion on the poor. And that's partly because it comes in a context of other Psalms, Psalms 9 to 13, where we have an interest in the poor and God's concern for the poor anyway. So it's literary setting. It's what's given it that bias. And it's an extra little phrase that comes in Psalm 14, which doesn't come in Psalm 53. Psalm 53, meanwhile, comes between Psalms 52 and 54, and they are quite vindictive, and Psalms very much aware of the difficulty of oppression by people speaking wicked words and offering violent deeds and so on. So Psalm 53 has got a slightly more bloodthirsty edition, particularly in verse 5, more imprecatory, much more curses on the enemy. The fight is actually with evil, not just foolishness. And I think that's their context, is what gives them that different, that slightly more compassionate sense of God's concern for the poor, and the fool not having anything to do with it in 14. And in Psalm 53, the idea of God's concern with vindicating those who are actually oppressed by those who are acting like the fool.
And the other thing, I suppose, just worth mentioning at this stage before I go back to Malcolm, is that the when Paul quotes this, which he does, there are some extra verses still, which
exactly, yes, and that's in Psalm 14. That's why I missed it out, because we're thinking of 53. Right. But yes, it doesn't come in there. It's an additional Greek version between verses 2 and 3, and Paul quotes it in Romans 3 verses 10 to 18, and it's not in Psalm 53. So there's clearly been another tradition which Paul has used, and the Greek version isn't the Septuagint. So it's actually, a different Greek version, which is, and some would argue he's picked it up. Some would argue that actually that was an additional part which was influenced by Paul's letters. It's difficult to know what came first, but yes, it's a very different expansion of just one psalm compared with the other, and it happens in 14, not in 53.
Right. Well, that's very fascinating. And before I come back to Malcolm to talk about his two poems really on this on these two psalms, let me welcome you again to joining with these conversations, and thank you for joining us. As I sort of say every time, they were starting point for them was this book, David's Crown, which Malcolm wrote during lockdown, and the Psalms Through the Centuries, which Sue completed her great sort of 3-volume commentaries on the reception history of the Psalms at the same time, and the Book of Praises, the selections of the illustrated translations that I've been doing over the years, and that we've got Psalm 53 as you've heard, but the rest of the conversations that we've had are in sort of archived, and if you sort of go below this, you'll see a link which will sort of take you to all those different conversations, which, if you enjoy this one, do make use of, and do let other people know about, because we would like them to be used. So Malcolm, it's striking to me that this second poem you've written is slightly sort of different in sort of tone from the previous one.
Yeah.
You take, well, tell us how you.
It's interesting because I really resonate with what Sue just said about the context of 14. That from 9 onwards, really, you're getting a real concern for the poor and a real cry against injustice, and particularly the injustice of particular oppressors and rulers. Now, obviously, so that's one context, and the other context in which I was working was obviously the present situation, not just COVID, but various other things, political developments in both America and Brazil and various. And it seemed to me, because I'd had to deal with some of that, like my poem on Psalm 10, for example, how long will you stand back and let them be these vicious tricksters, thinking they're so strong and make a boast of their own vanity? I when I published that one on my blog, I had an irate American person asking me why I was dissing Donald Trump, whose name I had never mentioned at any point in the Psalms. So I just had to look back and say, well, if he is the character you recognize, quod scripty, I made mention no names. So if you like, there was that personal focus. But in fact, in the one that followed 14, I immediately felt a conviction. Who am I to point the finger? Who am I to say that I'm not part of these oppressive systems? So when this whole thing came up again in the new context of Psalm 53, when with some of those psalms I'd had to wrestle with, if you like, the spirit of vindictive violence,
exactly,
in the mouth of the psalmist, that and my own sense that it's no good just pointing a finger at an individual, which I felt I was a couple of individuals I was guilty of in my version of Psalm 14, made me think much more about falsehood, which leads to oppression and evil, but falsehood in systems of thinking. And I was particularly, struck this time actually by some of the presumptions of a sort of very aggressive modern secularism that just wants to wants to abandon any past religious insights, that thinks it's got the solution to everything, that sees every issue as a tech fix, and actually how that gets us deeper into our difficulties rather than solving them. So the 53 one, it's interesting. I mean, it begins in my opening line was taking off from 52 is in the first person plural. We will flourish, but we live within a world that counts God out. And so the incipiens, the fool here, the fool is, if you like, particular individuals who've gained power in Psalm 14. But now I'm looking at what I regard as, if you like, the foolish atheism of our culture, the way we have a culture which just doesn't take God into account at all. And thereby, you know, in its own way comes a cropper, because it's leaving something massive out of its calculations.
Yes, yes. I mean, it struck me as actually really, I mean, when I first read this psalm, I put it this way, reading it again, it just seemed to me how deep this psalm was actually, and how much there was in it, because the fool, we tend to sort of think of the fool as the someone else.
Yeah, exactly. So that was
the fool can be the person who's reading the poem.
I mean, very much so, and the person who's writing it. So the verse that put me that way, you know, which perhaps because the context was different, didn't happen. It was the one. God looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that would understand and seek after God, but they were all gone out of the way. So that moved me onto this sense that the aggressively secular bit of our culture, which is dominant, you know, in terms of a lot of media and government decision making and that kind of thing, it's not asking the right questions. It's not, you know, it's gone out of the way. It's pursuing something, you know, in ignorance. But we're all included. That are they not without understanding? With that eat up with. So just this question of understanding, any that would understand, made me think: what are the, if you like, the philosophical assumptions that are preventing us from being as open to the spiritual and divine as previous generations clearly were? You know, which particular set of horse blinkers do we have on, as it were, that excludes certain things in order to achieve other things?
Yes.
A good example of the failure to understand one's identification with the fool is actually in a wonderful manuscript in the British Library. It's King Henry VIII Psalter, which he's got pictures in and little in the margins comments about you know, particular aspects of piety. Psalm 53, there's a picture of his court jester. In other words, he's not the fool. It's
I see.
Somebody out there and is dressed up as a jester.
Whereas it might have been better to have a picture of the king in motley.
You can find it on turning pages on the British Library.
Oh, really? Well, that's really interesting, because that juxtaposition of the king and the fool, that's fascinating too.
Yeah,
I mean, that's Henry VIII. This is before Shakespeare.
Yes, exactly.
Later on, when Shakespeare
normally identifying with David, you know, look how pious I am.
Oh yeah, exactly. No, I'm sure he thought that. But one of the things I think is, you know, one of the astonishing sort of achievements, you know, in Shakespeare and Lear, in terms of presenting us with certain archetypal things, is when he has the king and the fool together, you know, in, as it were, exile on the heath, and actually the fool is given all the wise lines and the king is still kind of raging in his folly. And this juxtaposition of the fool and the king and who's who. I mean, Shakespeare would have had a field day with that Psalter if you'd ever seen it.
Yes. I mean, I suppose that actually this is, I mean, that line, there's no one does good, not even one. I mean, Paul quotes that because actually he's sort of taking that, you know, if the cross is the solution, well, what is the problem? And the problem is all of us.
They were all gone straight. Yeah.
And I mean, that's why when I sort of read this first, and I particularly looked at that line, you know, they performed an abominable evil. All who do evil should be made to know it. They consume my people as they consume bread. And it just seemed to me to take me absolutely towards the 20th century. And this is the only image that I've actually used of a contemporary image. And you know, I put sort of an image that evoked sort of Auschwitz, because that seemed to me to be, you
we think of I mean, I was struck that it's that the fool says in his heart that, there are people who say in their heads there is no God, but actually act in their hearts as though there was one. And
Yes, indeed.
we're all great, hugely grateful for that. But
Yeah.
it's when it gets into the heart that when you start, just ignoring goodness, that then you get to the abominable evil. And that's what I suppose, and I think it's what the psalm is finally sort of getting to.
But you get this cry at the end. I love, the oh, that salvation were given unto Israel out of Zion. Oh, that the Lord would deliver his people. You can see, I guess when Paul is quoting the psalm earlier, he said, yes, but he has, and he has. Yeah. And the very way he's done it is the thing that fools call foolishness. It's the foolishness of the cross, that's actually.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
well, I think too, the psalm is not far away from Psalm 51, where we have that sense of the complete sort of evil within as well as evil without.
Yeah.
That plead for forgiveness, and it ends in a very similar way.
Yes, and there's a lot. I mean, in your poem, there's another thing about breaking the spell of disenchantment.
Yes,
which I think it's. Yes, it's just a
that comes from that's an allusion sort of obliquely to C.S. Lewis's famous sermon, The Weight of Glory.
Yes,
where he starts evoking our yearning for the far off country and the beautiful. And he said, do you think I am casting a spell? He says, well, perhaps I am, but we are all under an enchantment. We're under a false spell, and I need to wake you up from it. I need this other spell to wake you up. And I think this word enchantment is quite important, the disenchantment and the enchantment. A lot of people feel that one of the ways in which the imaginative arts, returning to their earlier and older relationship with faith and the church, can do is about, as some people call it, re-enchanting the world, changing the very way we perceive things. I mean, I'm not sure that re-enchanting is quite the right word. I don't think it's in our power to re-enchant the world. But what we can do is, in Coleridge's phrases, remove the film of familiarity and let ourselves see how God chants it into being, and it is in that sense enchanted.
Well, that might be a good note on which to hear the poem.
Right. Okay. So Psalm 53, Dixit incipiens. Though we will flourish in God's house forever, we live within a world that counts him out of every calculation, one that never considers that it might be wrong. No doubt can pierce our presumption. We dismiss the wisdom of the past, and yet we flout the principle of open-mindedness, presuming from the start on our conclusion. That cast of mind has cast a spell on us, a spell of disenchantment, the illusion that only matter matters. Break the spell, Lord Jesus, and undo our dark confusion. Deliver us again. Remove the veil, the thin familiar film that covers wonder. Let us rejoice to see your light prevail.